In Chapter 5, we will discuss the Texas Legislature. Legislative leadership. In the House, the leader of the House is the Speaker of the House, the same title given to the leader of the U.S. House of Representatives. He's third in line in succession to the behind the governor, behind the lieutenant governor, the president pro tem of the Senate. The House of Speaker of the House of Texas is elected from the entire House membership and serves as the presiding officer, meaning, he determines, sometimes who gets to talk and, the flow of the bills. He controls committee assignments. He or she has great power to control what kind of legislature gets passed, because by controlling the committees, we'll talk about this later, you control what kind of legislation gets through. Also names a Speaker pro tempore. The legislative leadership in the Senate. The lieutenant governor is president of the Senate and first in line of succession from after the governor. Elected statewide, whereas the Speaker of the House is elected from House membership, the lieutenant governor is elected by the population of the state in a statewide election to a 4-year term. They have greater control over the Senate agenda than the House Speaker of the House does over the House agenda, and committee assignments as well. The vacancy, if there is a vacancy, is filled by one of the 31 senators that has been picked to be the president pro tempore of the Senate, who is second in line of succession to the governorship. So basically, the pro tempore, both in the House and the Senate, is the next in line and replaces the leadership when they're out of the state or something happens. Now, the Speaker and the Lieutenant Governor, as I mentioned, they have very extensive powers with regard to the legislative process. They make committee appointments, and so depending on what political party the Speaker of the House or the Lieutenant Governor are part of, they can stock especially the leadership of the committees with people that agree with them and will pass legislation that they prefer. They also determine committee jurisdiction over bills, but there's many committees, and the Speaker and Lieutenant Governor decide which committee hears what bill. So if he has one special committee that is very friendly to him or her, then they might, if there's a bill that they especially care about, and if it fits into that committee's overall jurisdiction, then they will place it there. There's floor debate and voting. The presiding officer usually rules upon advice by the House and Senate parliamentarians on what rules will be used in votes, whether you can add amendments or filibuster, things like that. The lieutenant governor only votes in a case of a tie, so he doesn't vote. And generally they don't participate in the debate. Sometimes they do, but generally they'll make the initial presentation of the bill and let the rest of the legislature debate it, and then only vote in the case of a tie. The Speaker of the House may vote to give direction to members. He usually doesn't vote, but if the Speaker of the House feels very strongly about a bill and wants to show his interest in that bill, he may make the vote counts, but it's really more of a symbolic vote to let other members know that he feels strongly about it. The leadership team, committee chairs act as unofficial floor leaders, because the committee chairs, every member of the House and Senate belong in committees and participate in committees, and therefore the committee chairpersons, they tend to act as the lieutenant governor or the House representative, the Speaker of the House's voice on the floor, doing the bidding of the leadership. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the committee system itself, since we've already mentioned it. There are quite a few committees, the most important of which are the standing committees. And these are permanent committees, and they consider legislation. Like if a new bill is put forth, a proposed law, not everybody in the legislature discusses it together. It is placed in a committee, a small group of members, and they consider the bill. And there's a lot, like I said, a lot of committees. They consist of between usually 5 to 15 members in the Senate and 5 to 29 members in the House. Of course, there's a lot more members in the House than the Senate. Uh, uh, they're very substantive. I mean, the substance of the legislation. That's what they deal with. So you might have a banking committee. So anything that deals with banking would go to that committee, or an education committee. Anything that deals with the issue of education would go to the education committee. And so they focus on specific types of legislation. They also hold public hearings, and so they can kind of get feedback from the public. They also, of course, have special interest groups and lobbyists in their ear trying to influence their vote and trying to influence what goes into a bill. Um, and so they play a very important role in the legislative process. There are also procedural committees. They don't really deal with specific types of legislation. They deal with the rules regarding how bills are passed. The Rules and Resolutions Committee and the House Calendars Committee. And if you're interested in what all the committees are within the House, Texas House and the Texas Senate, I've provided a couple of links there or websites that can take you there and show you. Besides the standing committees, there are also conference committees. This is composed of 5 House representatives and 5 Senate representatives, and these committees are formed when you have differences in the House and Senate versions of a bill. Now, as I mentioned, both the House and the Senate has to pass the same bill for it to go to the governor to eventually become law. And usually what happens is one house or one body of the Congress, for instance, the House Representatives, the bill starts there. And they will go through the process of amending it, marking it up, changing it to make it look like they want it to look. And then it passes the House of Representatives. And then they will take that bill and move it over to the Senate. And the Senate, well, they could pass the bill just as it is from the House, but usually they go through their own process of changing it, marking it up, adding things, taking things out. And so when they complete their process and they vote to pass their bill, it's different from the original bill that the House passed. So you can't send 2 different bills to the governor for signature. So you create a conference committee with 5 from the House, 5 people from the Senate, and they will resolve the differences. Then once they resolve the differences and create a new bill, that new bill will go to the House and the Senate, and they will each vote on the exact same new bill. There's also select committees, also called special committees appointed by the governor, lieutenant governor, or the Speaker of the House. And they study major policy issues. Maybe there's something that is causing problems. We've had many select committees dealing with funding of schools in the state of Texas. That's always a big one. So they study major policy issues, things that need special attention. They may include private citizens. It doesn't have to be just, the select committees don't have to be just members of the legislature. And they can recommend legislation to the House and the Senate once they complete their work. Now, the legislators, they don't do all their work on their own. They have help. Most of that help includes their legislative staff. The staff provides legislators with information on administrative agencies and support efforts to review the performance of state agencies. So they let them know how things are going. They do the research with regard to making sure that the agencies are doing what they're supposed to do, following the law, using the money appropriately. Also, staff will help them research new legislation, maybe finding out more information about a bill and what's included in the bill, and just to have more information to make good decisions with regard to whether they will support or not a specific bill that's before the legislature. The staff includes personal staff, people that help them around the office, answer phones and things like that. Committee staff, when you're part of a committee, there are those that that work for the committee itself, not the legislators themselves, but the staff that helps them do their job. Budget staff, which includes the Legislative Budget Board, the LBB, which helps them determine, how much something's going to cost, the budget impact of different legislation. Also, part of the staff is the staff of the Sunset Advisory Commission, which we'll talk about later, which basically determines, whether agencies are either altered or abolished. And then the research staff, as I mentioned before, that they do maybe more in-depth research with regard to different legislative issues. The lawmaking process in the state of Texas is, it's pretty straightforward. Of course, it's going to be a little different than other states and a little different than the U.S. legislature, the U.S. Congress, but it's a pretty straightforward process. Begins with a bill introduction, which is called the first reading, where it's introduced to the legislature, and then there's committee action, which it's placed into a committee by either, if it starts in the House, by the Speaker of the House, or if it starts in the Senate, by the Lieutenant Governor. It's placed in a specific committee where that's called the consideration of the bill. That's where they will consider whether the bill will go to the floor for a vote or not. And the committee action includes public hearings. We mentioned that before, where the public can come and state their concerns about the bill. Studies, which the committee has the staff that can help, do more in-depth research on the bill, and then whether they're going to add amendments or changes to the bill during the committee action and consideration of the bill. If they decide to continue and to process the bill forward, there is floor action, and with that comes the second and third readings. And during these second and third readings, the bill will be debated on the floor. Amendments will be offered and votes will be taken, and it has to pass each of those readings, and then of course they'll vote on it. And then if they let's say that starts in the House, if the House votes to pass the bill, they will then send that bill to the Senate, and the Senate basically goes through the same process, and then if the Senate passes the same bill that the House passed, then it goes to the governor. If the Senate changes the bill, then they'll have a conference committee that we mentioned earlier that will create a compromise bill. Then the compromise bill will go to the House and the Senate, the exact same bill, and they will vote on that. And if it's passed by both the House and the Senate, then it goes to the governor, and the governor has a couple of options when it comes to the bill. He can sign the bill into law, or let it pass without signing it. Signing it into law basically says he approves of the bill. Letting it pass without signing it basically says, well, that's what the legislature wants, maybe that's what the people want, but I don't really like it, so he doesn't put his signature on it, or her signature on it. Or he or she, the governor, can use the veto, where they veto the entire bill, or use the line item veto power to veto certain parts of the bill that the governor doesn't like. This is just a little flow chart of the lawmaking process that we just covered, a little more specific with regards to the committee actions in the second and third readings. So it's worth a look. Some people are more visual learners and when they look at a flow chart or a graph, it makes more sense to them. So I'm one of those people. I like charts and graphs. Procedural obstacles to legislation. Besides just voting it up and down, there are also mechanisms to prevent it from even coming to a vote. One of which is deciding which calendar it is put on. The House Calendars Committee determines which calendar the bill goes before, and the different calendars have different priorities. So the Calendars Committee determines which calendar the bill goes before, or which calendar the bill goes on, in order to give it its time to be debated. There's also the Senate 3/5 rule that is sometimes implemented, that requires 3/5 of all senators to vote even vote on a bill. So you vote to vote on a bill, and it can allow and that's 60% to make that vote. And if you don't get that 60%, you can't even debate the bill on the floor. And this gives the like a minority group of senators, 40%, the ability to block legislation. And then the daily intent calendar, which is another one of those Senate calendars that can determine. We won't go too much into the calendars because they're convoluted and complicated, but basically they play a big role in determining when and how legislation is debated. Also, tags can be placed on a bill in a Senate committee for 48 hours by any individual senator to slow it down and to block it for 2 full days from being sent to the floor. And then famously the filibuster, where a member of the Senate can stand up and talk for as long as they can stand and talk, and to block legislation or to prevent a vote on legislation that they probably think will pass. So they just want to delay. And it's not used very often, but it is a procedure that allows either one or just a small group of senators to slow down or block legislation. Excuse me, shortcuts and confusion. Ways to get around some of the rules, or ways to streamline the process so not every single bill gets a full debate and a full vote. One of the ways is to attach one piece of legislation to another bill. So maybe you have 2 or 3 bills, and that may be similar, maybe not, but they can be challenged if they're not similar or germane. Germane means related to the bill. So you could cobble 3 together and have one vote on those 3 pieces of legislation that have been put together, instead of having to go through the 3 different processes in order to pass everything you want to pass. Also, you can place items on the local calendar or the consent calendar, which basically allows bills to be voted on and passed without debate. And that can save a lot of time. And usually they're minor bills that aren't very controversial at all, that maybe the public doesn't care a whole lot about. Or possibly if it's put on a consent calendar, it's because they don't want debate and they want to kind of slip it in without people noticing and without the public noticing. Also, there's compromise and consensus building. This usually takes place behind closed doors. It may discourage or prevent open debate. If you know your group of legislators wants one thing out of the bill and another group wants something else, instead of fighting it out in public on the floor, you might meet behind closed doors in somebody's office and work out a solution. Record votes are required on final passage, meaning that each member of the legislature has to go on record as to how they voted, so the public can be informed as to how their legislator is voting. It's very important. Sometimes, if there's non-controversial bills, they can do it. The entire House or the entire Senate may ask, all in favor say yay, all in favor say or say no, and then that way you can get a kind of a voice vote. But for any serious legislation, record votes are required. And as I said, division votes are allowed for amendments. This little graph kind of shows the increase in the number of bills and constitutional amendments that have been proposed over the years. The red line, which has a generally consistent upward trajectory, are the number of bills and constitutional amendments proposed from 1963 to 2013. The blue line is the number of bills and constitutional amendments of the red line. Of those, how many have actually passed? And it's like the total number of bills passed has not gone up very much over time, whereas the number of bills proposed, as you can see in the chart, has gone up quite a bit. So they're considering more bills and passing the same amount as they have in the past, for the most part. Now let's take a look at some what we call legislative norms. These are just kind of the common things that the legislators have to think about, and what constrains them, and what they have to give consideration to. Legislators have perceptions of how they are expected to carry out their responsibilities. Uh, One thing is whether they are a trustee or a trustee or a delegate. A trustee, just by the term, your constituents, if you're a legislator, if you represent a district, if you consider yourself a trustee, then you take into consideration what your constituents think, but they trust you to make the right decision for them. So you may not always vote in the way your constituents want you to vote. They trust you. You're a trustee, and you vote your conscience, basically, as a representative of your district. A delegate, some legislators see their role as a delegate, which means they should always, with few exceptions, always vote the way their constituents want them to vote. So the constituents have delegated their power to the representative. Uh, Rules and norms are designed to give conflict an element of civility. There's the way you talk to each other. You don't, call each other names. You use proper titles when you debate on the floor of the House or the Senate. And these rules and norms make it civil, even though each side may be have strong feelings about, you know, the bill or the other person. You stay civil and you stay polite, and that's been a norm of our society, not just in Texas but in the United States for a long time. Seems we're losing it a little bit recently, but I believe that we are naturally civil people. Legislators learn decorum and courtesy. Once again, it goes back to that civility, how you act. What's the appropriate way to act in this setting, this political setting of the House or the Senate? And personal attacks on other legislators are considered unacceptable and are and looked down upon by the rest of the members of the House or the Senate. There's also been a growth in partisanship over time, and kind of with that, we've lost some of the civility. But partisanship means, strictly sticking with what your party wants, and not, or refusing to maybe compromise as much as in the past with the other party. Some of the issues that have created this partisanship are the issue of taxes, how much to tax, what to cut when the tax revenues fall short. Because remember, you have to have a balanced budget. So if you budget for $1 trillion, just say for instance, and for some reason the tax revenues don't reach $1 trillion, so let's say that's $800 million or $800 billion instead, then you can't borrow the money because the balanced budget amendment or the balanced budget in the Constitution requirement. So there's $200 billion that you have to cut out of the budget, and of course, where is that going to be cut? That's going to hurt somebody. It's going to hurt somebody's constituents, whether you take it out of higher education, take it out of the K through 12 schools, you take it out of health services for indigent people or whatever. But the money has to come from somewhere, and it has to be cut somewhere. So that creates partisan divisions. Also, just in general, Texas in the last 30 or 40 years have been cutting a lot of social services to sometimes our most vulnerable populations: children, poor people, the elderly. And then there are other issues too, high-profile issues such as abortion, hate crimes legislation, and the issue of school vouchers that many privatization types would like to promote, which gives people the ability to, instead of sending their kids to public schools, they take a voucher with the tax dollars that they would have spent in that public school and can send them to any school they want. And they call it school choice, but what it's really doing is it's taking money out of the public school system for the children that need it, and giving it to people who have the ability to basically the mobility to send their children to whatever school they want. And so it's a very, very controversial issue. Republican majorities in the House and the Senate, consistent majorities have created partisan divisions. Being in control of all parts of government tends to allow whatever party it is, whether it's the Democrats, because they did it back in the 60s and 70s, and then the Republicans today, tends to allow them, if they control all aspects of the government, to move farther to the extremes with their legislation, because there really is no hurdles or obstacles for them from the opposing party to stop them. Also, changing seniority rules in the House. In the past, committee assignments and committee chairpersons were oftentimes based on seniority. So you could have, maybe the Republicans have the majority in the House, but maybe there's a Democrat who's the senior person on the committee, and that they used to potentially be maybe named the committee chair because of their seniority. But in changing rules, they've taken away many of those seniority rules, and now allows the Republican leadership to stack the committees with just Republicans or the majority of Republicans, especially in positions of leadership in the committees, the committee chairs. Now, while the main division within the legislature is parties, there are also divisions and groups within those parties, and also sometimes they cross party lines, and they are called legislative caucuses. And these are groups of legislators that organize themselves and form groups around certain issues, certain constituencies, maybe ideology, maybe gender, maybe race. So you might have a Republican legislator in Galveston and a Democratic legislator in Corpus Christi. But they may have, because they're coastal cities, they may have similar interests. So they get with other legislators that represent coastal districts, and they have their caucus, and they discuss the things that are the similar issues that they have because of their region. Also, different constituencies. If maybe a Democratic representative has a large constituency of retirees and elderly, and then another one, it's a Republican district, and that representative has a lot of retirees. Well, oftentimes they may come together to discuss, the common issues of having a large retirement district. And then ideology, once again, liberal, conservative, or more extreme versions of both of those things. So you may have a group of very, very, conservative legislators who group together to try to get their agenda passed and discuss their issues. And then you may have another group of the same party that are more moderate and that are maybe willing to compromise, and they might form their own caucus. Then, of course, gender, you have women's caucuses, and then race, you have the African American caucuses, Hispanic caucuses that come together and organize to address the issues that are specific to them. And so caucuses are very important. They can have great influence in speaker elections because everybody in the House of Representatives votes for Speaker of the House. So if you can get a couple of caucuses to come together to support a candidate, then that can greatly influence whether that candidate for Speaker of the House will win. And these caucuses help resolve statewide issues because oftentimes, as I said, they cross party lines. You might have Republicans and Democrats coming together for certain issues, and especially those that are statewide. Also, legislators and their constituents, of course, they represent their constituents, and these constituencies, these people in their districts can be very different. You may have one district that is maybe a majority white Protestant. You may have another district that is a big majority of Hispanic Catholics. And it's just you can have African American districts that are predominantly African American. So you can but you have other districts that are very mixed and very diverse, and so you have to find ways to represent your district's interests, because the constituents determine in the long run whether you're going to continue to do your job as a legislator, because they can vote you out if you don't. But that being said, most of us don't know how our state legislators especially vote on things. I mean, we may pay a little more attention to our U.S. Representatives and how they vote, but we don't pay a lot of attention, the average person, to our state representatives and state senators and how they vote. And so that gives them a lot of leeway to vote against maybe the best interest of their constituents. Also, as I mentioned, I think earlier, they should stay in touch with their constituents, let them know what they're doing. They do it through, you can monitor letters and phone calls and emails and petitions and mail newsletters and distribute surveys to the constituents. Now, as far as legislative decision making, excuse me, how the factors and what factors shape the decisions, and we've kind of touched on this throughout this chapter, but let's kind of go over it again. Obviously, factors that shape the decisions that legislators make, and how they vote, are the constituents and public opinion. What the people that voted for them, what do they want? Do they want to raise taxes? Do they want to lower taxes? Do they want more services, less services, whatever? But you have to take into consideration, as a legislator, the constituents and public opinion. Also, information and cues from lawmakers, your peers, the people in the legislature with you. You talk to each other. You learn from each other, and you try to develop a consensus about what is important and maybe how you should vote. Evaluations by legislative staff. Once again, you may have specialists in certain areas of the laws that that work on the staff, and you can get their feedback and their opinion as to whether this is a good bill, this is not a good bill, whatever. Of course, you're going to get information from interest groups that have a stake in it. Any law that's passed is going to impact somebody. If you have a banking law, it's going to impact banks, and you're going to have lobbyists from banking interest groups talking to you all the time as a legislator. If you are going to write laws that impact public schools, where you're going to have representatives for the teachers and the in your ear, talking to you, trying to get you to vote in what's in their best interest. And this just happens in every single bill usually every single bill that comes before the legislature, is you're going to have interest groups that care. The governor and other statewide officials, because they're the ones, they have a higher profile usually than the legislator, and so they can help promote your bill, or maybe you just want to, and if it's popular with the governor and the governor has popularity in the state, well, that might be something to consider, tying your vote with the governor or other statewide officials. Of course, the media. How is the bill playing in the media? What's the reaction? How can you promote it in the media? Is it getting negative media reaction? Is it getting positive media reaction? That can impact how you vote. And then finally, personal attitudes and opinions. Personal attitudes and opinions. It's this idea that in your gut, does it feel right? Does voting for this bill go against some moral or ethical principle that you have? Does it just not feel right? So you can have something that maybe deals with healthcare or maybe cancer research, and maybe you had, as a representative, maybe one of the members of your family had cancer or something like that, and it may impact how you view the bill. And as I mentioned earlier, there's different ways to look at it for each legislator. A trustee, as I mentioned earlier, will vote the way they feel like is best. They're going to vote what they think is best for their constituents and best for the state of Texas, regardless of whether the constituents agree. A delegate, even if a delegate disagrees with their constituents, he's going to vote how the constituents want, because he's been delegated to do that. Most are what we call politicos, which means on certain issues they'll be a trustee, and on certain issues they'll be delegates. Well, how it usually works is on the many minor issues, on the everyday bills that don't really impact a lot of people or that are not in the media, there'll be a trustee. They'll just vote how they should vote. But if it's a very high-profile issue, if it's a bill that people are talking about in the news and it's on television and on the internet everywhere, then people are paying attention to how you vote, and therefore you tend to vote more as a delegate. Vote the way your constituents want, because if you don't, those are the people that are going to be voting in the next election. So you serve as a delegate when it's a very high-profile issue. Now, there's also different legislative styles. Workhorses master the process and spend endless hours producing legislation. They're workhorses. They love the process. They love the idea of creating good legislation and making it work. These are kind of the best ones that you would like to have. You would love to have all your members of the legislature be workhorses and really care about the final bill and how it's going to impact people. Then you have grandstanders who are there just to enhance their own reputations. Show off, say, hey, everybody, look at me, look how great I am. I helped pass this bill or whatever. Then you have opportunists who pursue personal or political gains for themselves through the legislation, and also pass legislation just for advancement, to look good for everybody. So they're just out for themselves, and they're out for their own interests. So they're opportunists. They're taking the opportunity to use the legislative process to benefit themselves. And those aren't grandstanders and opportunists. Those aren't usually very productive people and useful people in the legislature. And then there are spectators. They serve as the legislators, but they don't like the work. They don't mind voting, and they feel like it's maybe important to vote, but they don't work on the legislation. They may not be grandstanders or opportunists, but they just sit around and watch everybody else do all the work, and then they just vote. Now, as far as legislative ethics and reforms, making sure the legislators are doing things above board and not being bribed, not being corrupt. In the contemporary era, legislature enacted significant changes in 2003, and these new provisions, in order to keep a check on the legislators, office holders and candidates have to identify the occupations of employers of people who contribute over $500. So you have to know who's giving money to these people making these decisions. Money talks, and so if you have a group of people or a business or a person who is giving a lot of money to a member of the legislature, it's going to impact how they vote. So we want to know, as voters, who is giving money to these people. It requires that financial reports be filed with the Ethics Commission electronically. That means those reports that you have to keep up with, you file them immediately. You send them to the Ethics Committee via electronically. Increased penalties for people who file their reports late. And office holders and candidates for municipal or city offices in the large cities have to file personal financial disclosure statements. So trying to keep a check on what money's coming in and who's getting the money with regard to these people who are making these decisions in our legislature.